He's won several design awards. He has a strong, I would call it, let's say, a product focus, because he's also designed and developed products for Cisco, for Nike, for BMW, and McDonald's. He's on the board of directors of a boatload of companies, and I shall not bore you with that because he knows a lot better to talk about himself than I do. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of Foundation Capital, welcome on stage, Mr. Steve Vassallo. Welcome on stage, Steve.
Hey there.
Hello.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you. Right. Oh, and you might need this.
I think I'm driving it right here. So
Don't need that?
Good. Nope, I think we're good.
Okay, well then,
right on.
Enjoy yourself.
Well, it's great to be here. I realize I'm the last presenter between you and the break, so I'm going to try to keep it interesting and keep it fast. So I am a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, but in a former life, as Daniel alluded to, I was a product designer at a company called IDEO. Now, after about 5.5 years at IDEO, we're losing clicks here. All right, so in the 5.5 years that I was at IDEO, I worked on everything from glasses to anesthesia delivery devices to this product, which was Cisco's last great desk phone. And I loved being a designer, and I still love to design things and make things in my spare time. But after more than half a decade at IDEO, what I realized was I wanted to be more than just a craftsperson. I actually wanted to get on the path to becoming an entrepreneur. So, at the time, though, there just weren't a lot of resources for those entrepreneurially oriented designers. And so I eventually kind of found my way and was lucky, but after kind of looking back on that, I've realized that I've been a designer since before being a designer was an actual thing. And when I look back on the 20 years when I was sort of that young designer leaving IDEO, I was perfectly happy designing really cool stuff. But I didn't know a thing about what was required to start a business. And when I meet young designer founders today, I'm struck by the fact that how many of them aren't any better prepared for that journey than I was 20 years ago. There just aren't a lot of resources out there for entrepreneurially oriented designers. There are a lot of these sort of very high-level industry stats and observations around numbers of designers where people are looking for on LinkedIn. But there's just not a lot of substantive insight around what's actually required to go from becoming a designer to becoming a founder. So if you want to be the next Joe Gebbia, who is the designer co-founder of Airbnb, what do you have to do? Or if you're Evan Sharp and you want to be the next one of him and you want to go start the next Pinterest, what do you have to do to level up? So I decided that I wanted to do something about this. So I wrote this book. It's called The Way to Design, and you can download it on thewaytodesign.com. It's for free. And really, the book is, I think about it as a guidebook. And it has sort of two purposes. One was really to sort of figure out how to help designers go from that sort of design craft orientation to becoming a founder of a company. The second one was really around how to build a design-empowered company. And then the third one that really emerged from the process of writing the book was, how can you use design in new and different ways to really have much more significant impact in the world? To write the book, I actually met with 50 designers, designer founders, design historians, interviewed them, recorded all those. And today I'm going to give you sort of a quick tour of the experience that I lived through over the last year and a half. So I'm going to give you two things, really. One is to sort of guide you through how design got to where it is today, and why it's so important for modern business. And then I kind of want to point the way forward for what does it mean and what is required to build a design-centric company. So first off, let me start with a brief history of how design got to where it is today. So when I started out as a product designer in Silicon Valley 20 years ago, design was just not held in very high regard. In fact, the founder of IDEO, David Kelly, used to say that the designers were often brought in as stylists to make what the engineers had already conceived of look pretty. So today, if we think about it, design in those times was really an afterthought, if it was a thought at all. Success really was this function of your company's technical prowess, whether you had faster or better performance. And what used to be last now is first. And why is that? So really the context has changed. Technology today has in so many ways reached an equilibrium point. If you look at what's going on with optical lithography, we're hitting the limits of what's possible. And I think Moore's law is going to be repealed really over the next 10 years. We'll eke out a few more improvements, and then we'll, of course, switch to quantum computing. But when you really look under the covers, most of the infrastructure today has been commoditized to the point where the most interesting stuff is actually happening at the top of the OSI stack, at the end interface with users. So, in many parts of the ecosystem, as well, as you all know, the consumer internet world, in particular, the marginal cost of software is zero. Design is now the differentiator. So my first project at IDEO was designing Nike's first line of performance sunglasses. And to get started on this project, I was set up with a $15,000 SGI workstation with a $20,000 CAD package, sold by really expensive sales reps who I'm not sure what they actually did. And then I had to go make these $50,000 prototypes in our machine shop on equipment that cost more than $500,000. When we wanted to go launch these products to production, we would send these CAD files and these drawings literally half the world away, and 12 weeks later, we would get these hogged-out hardened steel tools that basically were the $100,000 a piece that were sort of the results of all this work. But if you're a product designer today, you can get started with a freeware version of SketchUp. You can make your first prototype on a desktop MakerBot. You can go raise $100,000 in crowdfunding on Kickstarter. You can get soft tools from PCH. You can then go set up distribution partnerships with Amazon or Shipwire or both. And you can start to sell your products off your own website, in your own voice, to your own consumers. That's pretty different. Now, this cool shoe, it's from a company called Carbon. It was started by a friend of mine, Joe DeSimone, who's a professor of chemistry at UNC. And Carbon actually allows you to take 3D scans of your feet and then actually have custom shoes that are basically designed for your own height, weight, fitness activity, and gait. And it's that midsole section in the middle that's totally new. So instead of being like a size 42, when you look forward, you're going to have a size Jane or John. Now, the second thing that's radically changed is in consumer expectations. It used to be that businesses were not doomed if they didn't pay attention to design. Even if you had a poorly designed product, you could still sell hundreds of millions of products just by really smart sales and marketing. But I think those days are numbered. And that's thanks to the work of people like Steve Jobs or Hartmut Esslinger or David Kelly, who really got consumers to demand so much more from these user experiences. Now, the iPhone, which just sold its 1 billionth unit last summer and, of course, celebrated its 10th anniversary just a few months back, is already the most successful product in all of human history. But most important thing that it really did was that it changed the expectations of end consumers. What do they expect from technology? They expect delightful to use, masterfully designed. So for consumers today, design is no longer negotiable. And there's a third reason why design has come into the forefront in Silicon Valley and in the world. And that's that the very meaning of what design actually is has changed. Design goes well beyond the veneer, beyond the sort of drop shadows and drapes as sometimes people think about it. Design is now thought of as the what. What problem are you trying to solve? What challenge are you going after? What positive change do you want to leave in the world? In a world in which anything really can be built, the burden for entrepreneurs has actually shifted from whether something can be built to whether it should be built in the first place. Or as Evan Sharp, the design and co-founder of Pinterest, says here, where engineering is all about capability, what we could do, design is all about suitability, what we should do. So design is this messy, holistic, human-attuned process for solving problems, not just stylistic ones, but problems of all level of importance. And it's designers who serve as that special bridge between the user, the technology, and the business. So these three forces really have collided over the last 20 years to lead to this moment, that design has really come into its own. And it's the best time in history to be a designer. Large incumbents like GE and Samsung and IBM have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to build their own design studios and hire thousands and thousands of designers. Google has tried to reinvent itself as basically a design-oriented company. And of course, there are multi-billion-dollar startups littering the world now that have been started by designer founders. But don't take Stanford or Harvard's word for it. On the ground, this is the number of venture-backed companies that have been founded by designers really growing by the year. 10 years now, how that's exploded. So designers have gone from these 11th hour stylists to ground zero founders. And I've interviewed many of them for this book, as well as a few totally new green ones. And here's some of the things that we discovered as we sort of look forward. So here's what I think the future of design really will be. If it's not already apparent, I believe that design is the greatest lever for the greatest companies yet to come. And it's my conviction that this will be the century of design, where core value creation flows not from an unimpeachable technical founder, from entrepreneurs instead who have a deep, very intuitive sense for the human condition. I believe we need more designers who really can start companies and more business and technology founders who can really understand the power of design. So what does that mean for you all? What is it going to take for you to actually become that design tech leader and deliver on this vision? You're going to have to level up in 3 different ways: the individual, the organizational, and the global. So let me start with the individual. So in my book, I break down 5 things that an individual designer needs to do in order to level up. So let me bounce on a few of these. Actually, I'm going to use some stories from the interviews of the folks that we met with. This is of the 50 people that we met with. Starting with this first one, thinking big. So whether you're a designer or an engineer or a business person, there's this very strong gravitational pull for you to get drawn into the details of your work, whether that's the pixels or the do loops or the spreadsheet macros. And it's a totally natural thing, and that's how many products are born. But when Nate Weiner, who is the founder of a company called Pocket, when he began that company, it started out as a very personal problem. He was working at a web agency in Minnesota, and he wanted to teach himself how to code. So he began emailing himself links and links all day, and they would get lost in his inbox. So he wrote this very, very simple Firefox plugin. It was 160 lines of code. He still has it today, shares it to the new employees. And all it did was surface 2 things: save and read later. He basically shared that with a few friends, and a couple months later, Lifehacker picked it up, and then it just blew up from there. And what Nate realized was that a lot more people had the same problem he did. So he quit that job at that web agency, and he threw himself into Read It Later. Now, I met Nate a couple months later, actually at a Stanford D School event, and here's a slide I recently dug up. So this is from his original Read It Later pitch. He doesn't like me sharing these things because, of course, you have to sort of see what happens later, right? But what started out as this really lightweight browser plugin had basically begun to become something much, much bigger than Nate had ever expected, and certainly even I did. And Nate saw this massive opportunity long before it was obvious to other people. It was clear it was not just about sending articles or podcasts or YouTube videos. It was about any kind of content. And it was clear it was not just about the US, it was a global phenomenon. And ultimately what he realized was it wasn't just about saving, it was about sharing as well. And so from this little 160-line plugin was born a much larger company that now basically is a global service used by tens of millions of users as part of Mozilla. But one thing that Nate would admit to you if he were here today, I guarantee you still, was that when he started Pocket, he did not know a thing about business. And so that's why I think it's incumbent on designers and technologists and even those freshly minted MBAs to actually get smart on business. So when I worked at IDEO, David Kelly used to say this thing. He'd say, "The best idea wins." And I believed him for a really long time. In fact, I still remember how uncomfortable I would feel when the conversations would shift to net margins or amortization of our capital expenditures or customer acquisition costs. And it's not that these were actually hard technical challenges. It's just that I hadn't given myself the time or the space to actually go and study them. So I decided I want to go to business school. And here's how I kind of reasoned this to myself. And in fact, this is literally a diagram, an actual diagram from my Stanford Business School application back in 2001. This predates the Stanford D-School Venn diagram, for those of you who might recognize the similarities. But the point was super simple for me. So as a designer, I was super comfortable in this upper left sort of circle, which was about designing products that meet humans' needs and wants. And as a former roboticist, I was pretty comfortable designing products that had deep technical challenges. But when it came to these business needs, it was completely foreign. I had no idea what I was doing. But I will tell you, even as an investor today, I'm struck by the number of aspiring entrepreneurs who I meet, by the way, from all backgrounds, business backgrounds as well, who don't really have a good sense of the business fundamentals, who aren't asking the really hard questions of themselves or their teams, who haven't already calculated their LTV to CAC, who don't know that maybe that's actually not a very good metric because it's misleading in many other ways. And oftentimes, these aspiring entrepreneurs optimize on the wrong thing. They might optimize on valuation, but not pay attention to the terms that might actually come back to haunt them later. So if any of this stuff sounds foreign to you, you definitely need to get smart on the business. But don't forget that you're a designer founder, not just a business person now. Because design is going to be that key differentiator for the next great companies of the future. And the only way that your startup can really be one of those special companies is if you are an advocate for design. Now, I understand how hard it is to actually keep a little startup on the rails. Sometimes those short-term decisions to optimize around revenue trump everything else. But if you keep letting those other things crowd out design, after a little while, it won't be core to your company's strategy. In fact, one of the entrepreneurs that we met with during the interviews for the book told the story of how the insidious influence of the sales culture of their company basically pushed design out of the way, and ultimately him as well. He's no longer with that company. And I will tell you, when we met with Joe Gebbia at Airbnb, he shared a story of the early days of Airbnb when he and Brian had a really big problem. The bookings weren't taking off. The company was pretty close to going bust. And they had this notion that they should just be sort of sitting at their desks, coding their way out of all these challenges. In fact, they had this sort of notion, this false notion, that the dogma in Silicon Valley was to sort of solve these problems from your desk. But then they got a kick in the ass, and they realized that first and foremost, they were design-centered, human-centered designers. And so they hopped on a plane, they went to New York City, and they met with their early adopters. And what they learned was just completely eye-opening to them. Things that were supposed to be really simple, 2 clicks, took 12 clicks. And then they realized that, really nice photographs and these pithy, clever descriptions could actually improve a sense of quality and trust. Trust between the homeowners, the renters, as well as the property owners themselves, and most importantly, a sense of trust actually in the platform that is Airbnb. So you all have heard this term, the minimum viable product. Some of you were in the room earlier. I'll let you read this for a sec. And this term of minimum viable product, it's literally gospel in Silicon Valley. But Joe Gebbia rejects this construct outright. And I will tell you that Joe now thinks about product launches just like first dates, where you would never expect minimum viability on a first date. You expect minimum awesome products. And that's how Joe thinks about launching products at Airbnb today. It doesn't mean doing everything all at once, but it means having the right level of finish and the right questions that you're answering. And that's what it means to be an advocate for design. So on to my fourth point, breaking out of the craft box. So if you're going to be running a business, you can't solely be a craftsperson anymore. You have to really wisely pick when you can go into the details and when something that's not perfect is still good enough to ship. And this is definitely easier said than done. In fact, of the scores of founders who we met with, the number one issue that they struggled with was that gravitational pull, that sort of sense that they got drawn into the details. And I totally get it. I feel that tractor beam of compulsion whenever I see something that's out of sorts, and if there are engineers here, you do too, I know that. But as a founder, you now have this obligation to become a builder not just of the products, but of the teams and a design-led company. And that really means a whole new arsenal of skills. It means, how do you facilitate among the different stakeholders? How do you assess viability and feasibility? It means getting smart on recruiting and boosting your organizational influence. So you really need to find that proper ratio of tweaking pixels with actually executing a strategy, because your company is your craft now. So Steve Jobs really is revered as one of the ultimate designer founders, down to the exact details of what he would spec for Apple's stores, the wood material exactly as it was. In fact, he was often described as a designer's designer, but the underreported feature of his success was his ability to actually switch from those tiny product details to these very large issues and then zoom back again. In fact, when you look at the original iPod, he cared as much about that interface as he did about striking the right deals with the music industry to be able to have 1,000 songs in your pocket. And I remember when he came back to Apple in 1997, one of the things that he did, which was, I think, a great example of this, is he saw 12 different marketing departments running 12 different marketing campaigns. And he basically said, we're going to reduce all that down to one thing and have focus. And that was the beginning of the whole Think Different campaign. So the fact of the matter is, Steve Jobs wasn't trained as a designer or a coder or an engineer. He was a conductor of them all. And the last point in the star brings us to the next level at which you're going to have to raise your game: the organizational level. So even though I've been focusing on these individual skill sets for you to grow into, it's really important to remember that it's not just about you. In fact, it might be contrarian to say, but it's not even all about your product. What really matters for modern companies is building the methods and processes for many rounds of problem solving, creativity, and iteration. Every startup really needs to design not just a great product, but a process for continuously designing many great products, or what I call a system for repeatable genius. Because if there's one overarching theme in the book, it's scale. Scale yourself, scale your company, scale your way of analyzing problems, scale the way you think about what it means to design. So back when I was at IDEO, we used to display our best products in these glass trophy cases. They were right in the lobby. And we were definitely proud of these products. But there is a danger in fetishizing the product. And it creates this false impression that design is this finite, indefinite thing. That it's this bullseye you hit and then call it a day. But design isn't something that can be bottled under glass or genied up inside of these physical artifacts. The product is a point, it's not the point. And that's why I like to say product market fit is a liquid, not a solid. And I promise that is German beer. So, achieving product market fit, which is again one of those gospel terms in Silicon Valley, it's a really awesome thing. And a lot of companies actually never get there. But it's actually a transitory achievement, a false summit of sorts. And why is that? Because your customers want more, the competitive landscape changes, new technologies enable new features or functions and form factors. And so the goal is not to achieve product market fit, it's actually to achieve a regular drumbeat of many product market fits. And that means designing a process. So as a design tech leader, your job is to forge that set of standards and that environment for your individuals and your teams to be able to be challenged, to care deeply about every facet of the mission, and to build this process for repeated rounds of excellence and a culture that just refuses to accept mediocrity. Or as Joe Gebbia says, the machine that builds the machine. Now this is what a machine might look like. And what machines will look like will vary depending upon company. This is actually a leveling up framework It was developed by Heather Phillips at the Designer Fund, where I'm an investor and an advisor. And it was developed really to sort of help companies scale what they should be doing at what stage with respect to design. It doesn't make sense to get into the details, but the moral of the story and this table is that designers and tech leaders need to inject as much intention into the development of the teams and the processes that they inject into the products themselves. And that's not intuitive for a lot of people. So finally, design tech leaders will need to level up with respect to the global context. So the world has become infinitely more complex and intertwined just over the last 2 decades. We're now generating 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every day. We're halfway to connecting everyone on the planet with 3.7 billion internet users worldwide. And by 2020, 80% of the world's adult population will have a smartphone in their pocket. We live in this massively complex, interconnected world. And it's increasingly difficult to live in this world, never mind to start a company, without having a clear sense of how we affect and are in turn affected by all of the different parts of this global system. And that's why I think design thinking, which really emphasizes solving problems from a human-centered perspective, actually needs to look wider towards a humanity-centered perspective and absorb some of the thinking around systems thinking. It's a totally new body of thought. It's not new to many folks, but to design thinkers it is. And it may be unfamiliar to you. So it's a mode of analysis that really has been around for some time, but it has this newfound relevance in the everything is connected internet world. Systems thinking really is about a mindset that recognizes the interconnectedness of things. It's about seeing the relationships between different components of a system and then beginning to anticipate the consequences of those relationships that are just as important as the individual components themselves. So what is this exactly? I'm going to tell you using one of my favorite frameworks in systems thinking, and it's called the iceberg model. So I'm going to walk you through this real quick, but basically the idea is this. At the top of the iceberg are these things we call events. This is the stuff that happens on a day-to-day basis, kind of the hurly-burly of life. Underneath that are these patterns. So this is when we begin to sort of have these behavioral memories, things that are sort of repeated instances of those same events. They're kind of like, you're seeing them over time, you're not necessarily always connecting them below, but then you think about this concept of structures. And the structures are how the different pieces of the system are organized and fit together. And at the very bottom is a hugely important thing, it's the values. And this is what our vision is for the future. It's the basis for our mental models. So let me give you an example that sort of ties this together from my office at Foundation Capital. Now, I know all of you have been victims of a bad meeting before. And I will tell you, it was about 2 months ago, one of my partners called us out. This was after a Monday investment presentation. And he basically said, like, guys, we weren't on our A game today. What was going on? And there was a quick conversation. It turned to all these events that just weren't working. A couple of my partners were actually on their cell phones. Another one stepped out to use the washroom. Another one of them was just sort of low energy. And while we couldn't agree on which of these behaviors was the most problematic, we all agreed that there was a pattern of inattentiveness that we were not comfortable with. And specifically, it didn't tie to our value of respect for the entrepreneur. So we quickly brainstormed some new ideas, some structures really, for how to make these meetings better. We basically said no smartphones or laptops between you and the entrepreneur. We brought in our administrative partner to take notes for all of us, because of course everyone was using that as an excuse while they were playing words with friends. And then the third most important thing we did, the third structural kind of tweak, was we turned our days upside down so that we actually had these entrepreneurs in the mornings when we were at our best instead of in the afternoon when folks were already tired. And so those 3 changes enabled us to have much better meetings. And I think this same exercise is true in so many design challenges, where our first temptation is actually to react to the events above the waterline, to blame or to judge, and to react to these symptoms instead of really tuck into the root causes and the system failures. Now, there are several other really important concepts in the book related to systems thinking, and there's obviously not enough time to tuck into them today. But I want to hit just one more, and that is this notion which challenges designers to more carefully consider the interplay between these disparate components of a system. So why is that? Well, in the inextricably connected world we now live in, it's not only not possible, but it's definitely not wise for you to solve a problem, a specific narrow part of the problem, without taking notice of the larger system. And the trick here is to analyze these systems with an eye towards leverage points. Think about this as the smallest nudge for the greatest effect. It's kind of like an acupuncture point that takes advantage of the fact that our bodies are totally networked. But the idea here is that when you approach a design challenge, instead of going after the easy things, oftentimes reacting to those events, force yourself to look for these areas where a small, often subterranean tweak in the system can actually create a whole renovation of the system. Those are the really powerful leverage points. So I'm going to give you one quick example on this. It's from the US, so forgive me for that. But if you were to ask an American friend of yours, which airline in the US is the most design-led airline? I'm 99% sure they're going to say Virgin, and that's because of the cool cabin lights and the cool pilot's jackets and, of course, the hilarious safety videos at the beginning. But the real genius when you think about systems is Southwest Airlines, which discovered how to load and unload the planes in a highly, highly efficient way that enabled them to turn around the planes much faster and ultimately pushed them into being one of the most profitable airlines in the world. So, for me, this book was a manifesto of sorts. As the world grows more complex and intertwined and uncertain, I believe that it's entrepreneurs who have the moral obligation and the unique ability to really take on the hardest challenges of our times. To focus on problems of consequence, to lift your eyes out of the pixelated sand and look at the challenges that are much, much more substantial. Most of the calamities that we face today are ones that have been caused by an insufficient understanding of, or perhaps even an utter disregard for what is human, for how people engage with and impact each other and the world, and how they're impacted in kind. Most of these could be alleviated or even cured with solutions that are truly human-centered. And it's my assertion that the next generation of designer founders and design tech leaders will be the key to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now we'd like to do some Q&A. We've just been checking backstage. There are quite a few questions. First one, pretty straightforward. What shall I do if I'm not an awesome designer?
Well, if you're not an awesome designer, you can certainly get better. That's the obvious answer. But what I see oftentimes, and we do this in workshops, when we do this sort of way to design workshops, is look for sort of your strength finder. And so if you're really strong on the technology side, and you're curious about those design components, but you're not really sort of committed to learning everything about them, you need to go find a designer founder. That's probably the sort of the most obvious answer, but I think that's oftentimes the case. But if you're curious and you want to educate yourself and do what Nate did, who was a designer who taught himself how to code, then you just got to go tuck into it.
Thank you. What should a design process look like in a small to medium startup?
Yeah, so oftentimes in the small to medium startup, I think about this as most of the decisions get made around a table of like 8 to 10 people. Sometimes sort of call this the Jeff Bezos 2-pizza rule. So if you have more than enough people that you can't feed them with 2 pizzas, then it's probably too much. But I think oftentimes what you're seeing, and in fact that framework that I flashed up that was in tiny font will give you an example of this, is when you're just a single designer, maybe and a couple of engineers, most of that is lightweight processes, one-page quick requirements documents, a lot of ethnography where the designers and the engineers are oftentimes sort of testing these things with the users themselves, doing what Joe and Brian did at Airbnb. So it's very lightweight. And of course, as you scale to much larger companies, you need to start figuring out harder problems like, what's the right ratio between designers and engineers? Or should the designers sit with other designers, or should they be sitting with engineers and being distributed about. So there's lots of subtlety in that diagram, so definitely worth checking out.
Thank you. Now, a bit of a different question. How did you become a venture capitalist after Stanford Business School?
I started 2 companies, one of them right out of school, and then went on to start a second one. And I was actually an entrepreneur in residence at Foundation. It's a very common path for us to start companies, literally these kind of almost farm-raised companies, if you will. And I was on the path of starting the company, and a couple months in, one of my partners said, hey, you should think about investing. You keep bringing these cool projects in. I said, I don't want to do that. I want to keep building this product. And then 2 more months later, I realized I was having more fun there than I'd ever had in my life. So that was back in end of 2007, and I've made about 20 investments since then.
Thank you. Anything specific you're looking for? Just out of interest? If there's someone in the audience saying, hey.
So we invest in everything from broad consumer to specializing in financial services and financial technologies to systems infrastructure. We've done a lot of work in and around that. We were early investors in Netflix, early investors in a company called Atheros. So if any of you are using Wi-Fi today, all of you are, it's probably the company that invented that, was acquired by Qualcomm. So lots of things. The only thing we don't do are sort of the wet sciences. So we don't do pharma or sort of the chemistry-related stuff.
And just out of interest, what's the best way to approach you? Is it say, oh, I need money? Or
not that. It's usually through an introduction. It doesn't always have to be. We often get these introductions from folks who we know and have trusted. It doesn't need to be a long-standing relationship, but I think usually that warm introduction goes a long, long way. We appreciate those and are always sort of looking for those.
Okay, so people that just kind of leap for you, you don't like that?
It just doesn't. I mean, unfortunately, we just get completely swamped. In fact, I think we probably look at roughly 3,000 new investment opportunities every year, and we invest in 10. So I have to get really good at saying no. I hate it, but I have to get good at it.
Sweet.
Yep.
Thinking of Steve Jobs as a designing expert, does the principle of design also apply to the HR side of business?
Every aspect. So, it's fascinating to me. I talk about this a little bit in the book. When you think about what it truly means to design an org, we oftentimes just get snapped into that sort of product domain. But I will tell you, one of the great things about having worked with Apple very closely when I was at IDEO was sort of seeing into their operations team. So who would think that you could apply design thinking into operations or manufacturing? But what I saw over and over again was that the default of so many companies in the manufacturing and operations team was to say no, was to basically say, hey, the idea of machining MacBook Pros from a solid billet of aluminum, no way, that's never going to happen. And of course, that's exactly how they do it today. So what you saw in the case of Apple was, instead of trying to sort of keep the thing that was always cheap and try to keep that cheap, they had a different mentality, which was, how can I take the thing that is the right solution and make it cheap? So it's a very different thing, and that's about having the right people and the right frame of mind. So for sure, I think HR is a big piece of that.
How many designers per developers in a startup?
So that depends. It depends entirely on the scale. So startups for me are companies that are born from whole cloth, and oftentimes you'll see sort of 1 or 2 designers and maybe 2 or 3 or 4 engineers working well together. By the way, designer, I'm sort of being very sort of general in my definition of design. There's folks that include sort of information architects, ethnographers, human factors experts, visual designers, graphic designers, user experience people. So I would say the right mix of those is somewhere sort of 1 to 3 is what we see in the small scale companies. And then as they get larger, it may sort of get a little bit less weighted towards the design side of the house. The other question, or the other point I mentioned briefly, is this notion of concentration versus integration. So your design teams in the early days are often best integrated out among the technology teams and the business teams. But what I've noticed, and I saw this both in my own personal experience, and it came up many times during our interviews, was, but wait a minute, when designers aren't hanging out with designers, oftentimes their work isn't as good because they don't have this ability to sort of iterate in real time. And so figuring out these ways of having designers spend time with each other, whether that's actually physical spaces or events on a regular basis, turns out to be really important to get right too. So it's not just about number, but it's about how you actually spread them through your organization.
Here's a question. Let's see if we know what it kind of refers to. It says, It sounds like a skill need to be accomplished by one person. Why not separate knowledge towards a couple of experts, i.e. design, business, tech in a team?
Yeah. So you saw the Venn diagram, right? There's 3 circles, tech, business, user, tech, and business. And I think the great companies live in that very, very small section in between. There are definitely companies that live in other areas that get along, but the ones that are truly sort of memorable, lovable companies are the ones that live in the middle. Now, it doesn't mean, whoever asked this, it has to be one person, but it does mean that the folks who are not designers, or the designers who are not business people, have a very, very good attuned sense of those adjacent disciplines. At IDEO, we used to call these T-shaped people. So you had one depth. It might be in design, or it might be in electrical engineering or computer science. But you had this top of the T, which was this appreciation and definite mutual respect for those adjacent disciplines. So we look for T-shaped people, and you put multiple T-shaped people together, and then you can kind of you can assemble a really fantastic team that way. But it doesn't have to be all in one head. It's great when it happens.
Here's an interesting one. How to deal with overly sales-focused co-founders?
Oh, boy. This one's really hard. And as I mentioned, I alluded to one of the individuals we met. He was a design co-founder, one. He had 3 technical co-founders. Brilliant product, really strong sort of user-centered approach. And about 2 years into the company's life, they began to become much more sales-oriented, which they needed to. But they became slaves to sort of the sales metrics. And I actually sort of think it's sort of a two-sided issue in this case. Number one, this entrepreneur was unable to scale his design org. He never got good at the hiring. He never got good at the recruiting and the retaining. And so design ended up just being him. And so he got kind of like, whatever, poisoned by the creosote bush above him. But it was also, I think, a lack of respect on the other side as well. And so when I wrote the book, the audience really was two sides of the same coin. Designers needing to get smart on these business and technology-related issues, and business and technology executives really needing to understand the design component. So it's a marriage of those things to really get it right.
I mean, we've had this, the next question, we've kind of had it, although 7 people have upvoted it. How do you find a good designer as a small startup?
As a small startup. So, we host a number of events that pull designers together with other designers, as well as other technology founders, co-founders, these sort of founder dating events. You guys have all probably been to them. So we do that very regularly. We also host a number of events. So the Designer Fund I alluded to as well. They actually run a program called Bridge, where they bring in designers and they teach them a whole bunch of these things to be able to interact with the other disciplines, if you will. And so we use those networks very, very selectively to sort of pair people together. And I will tell you, though, even though it may sound easy, I think finding a designer is oftentimes harder than finding that brilliant full-stack engineer, because these people have a very different sort of wiring. And they have to, of course, respect these other components of the business as well. And so it makes them almost sort of the true unicorns of sorts.
How important is data in the design process?
So data has never been more important for designers to start using and balance with their own sort of intuition. We saw this in one of the interviews. It was a company in San Francisco. I won't mention who it is, but the designer got so good with the data science team, and in fact started asking them so many questions and was burying them, that they gave him his own data scientist to basically work with him kind of paired up. And what I think is brilliant about the use of data today, as opposed to when I think back on when I was a designer 20 years ago, you kind of had all these designers walking into these meetings and saying things like, oh, like I feel like it should be this way, or I have this sort of emotion around this feature or this function. And you don't have to have that intuition as much anymore. You certainly have to create these stepwise changes and sort of have a vision for the future, but you can build multiple versions of the product. You can test them with Optimizely, or you can do some of the things you heard earlier in building an MVP, where you can not have the product fully developed, but sort of begin to hint at what that thing might look like. And so I think really that balance of figuring out how to use your intuition and then the data to sort of inform the intuition, but ultimately the marriage of those is what's most important.
That's a good one. What kind of startup design philosophy does keep you from investing in a company? What do you hate? What turns you off? We go like, no.
I think the thing that probably comes out very quickly is entrepreneurs who are just singularly focused on the economic outcome. If they're just there to start a company to get rich, it's not a fit for us. And I think there are a lot of reasons to be an entrepreneur. Maybe it's you want to work with your friends. Maybe it's you want more flexibility. Maybe you actually want to be rich. But I think understanding your own motivations, why it is that you're doing this, what really fills your tank at the end of the day, and being honest with your co-founders and your prospective investors about what those things are. And I think it's really that alignment of when those entrepreneurs sort of really figure it out, what they care about, that aligns with us. And we care about people who want to build companies of import. We want to invest in the next Netflix or the next Lending Club or the next Sunrun. So it's really getting that pairing.
We have 30 seconds for one last question. How will AI affect the way we design?
So AI is a great example of one of those fundamental technologies that is happening under the covers that I think has an opportunity to be kind of a next platform change for us in the tech industry. There are very few platform changes. They come along every kind of 5 to 10 years. We've lived through the mobile platform change. Before that, sort of the rush to the cloud. Of course, mobile devices as well. And AI, I think, has tremendous potential. It's still very early days. I think most of the applications will be very narrowly focused. Most of them will be related to sort of sensory related applications. And I think it has the potential for us to sort of, again, begin to sort of see stepwise changes in the things that we can see systems do, particularly sensing systems. So I'm super excited about it. I'm excited about the top of the stack, the bottom of the stack, and a lot of stuff in between.
And speaking of excited, have you seen that?
All right.
You should take a look at that. Well, in that sense, Steve Vassallo, thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thank you, Steve Vassallo.
Thanks.
Cheers. Thank you.